podcast. Okay, so I'm here to report on here to report on a project that we've been doing. It's a project that was funded by the Australian Government's Office for Learning and Teaching, and it is a project that has been done between three institutions: the University of Melbourne, which is where I'm from, Macquarie University, which is in Sydney, and the University of South Australia in South Australia, obviously. So yeah, it's been a very interesting project that's been running for the last 2 years, and the idea here was that we wanted to look at how we could deliver learning analytics to teachers in a meaningful way so that they were able to improve their teaching and learning practice. So what we're going to do in this presentation, and when I say we, I'm only going to be here for about 5 minutes, and then Aneesha's going to take over, because I must give credit where credit is due. And to be honest, a lot of the work around the conceptual framework that we've developed as part of this work came from Aneesha's brain. So even though we have some of the world's leading professors on this project, Aneesha really managed to bring all of this stuff together in what I think is quite an interesting way, which we hope will be informative for future learning analytics developments. So anyway, we thought that what we wanted to do is look at the types of analytics that would be useful to teachers, especially in relation to pedagogical intent or learning design. I guess we kind of, in our project, we've been using those terms interchangeably, but I guess, you know, how you view learning design or pedagogical intent is up to you, I suppose. But the idea was that we wanted to develop a framework that would guide the development of a learning analytics tool, which we have developed and which Aneesha will go through. So the main aim of the research really was to better understand how analytics can be interpreted, applied and actioned by teaching staff. So that idea of we've got teachers, we've got students, we know that there's a lot of data around, we've heard this many times over the term of this conference, but we still, and I know a lot of people have been dealing with this, certainly at this conference as well, wanting to understand how we can best give this data to teachers. So we've called the project Completing the Loop, and the idea is completing that feedback loop of giving data back to teachers. So they design a particular learning activity or a course, there's data that's generated, and we want to give that data back to the people who did that original design, i.e. the teachers. So we know that there's lots of data, but we really want to understand more about what this data should look like and that will be meaningful to the teachers. Also, what's key to this project is understanding when this data would be most useful to teachers. We often talk about building systems and just sort of putting them out there, but we don't really understand about how often teachers may want to interact with this data or require this data. Do they really want the stuff at the end of semester to be doing curriculum redesign and review, or is it something that they want to be able to do in real time on the fly to make interventions with students as the course goes on? And of course, we then want to see what the actions are. And I'll give you a bit of a spoiler. We found that the teachers, when we actually piloted our tool, the actions were not very evident. And it was a bit disappointing, but at the same time, when we went back to the teachers to talk to them and said, what sort of actions have you taken in response to using the tool? They said, well, I'm not going to take any actions this semester. I just wanted to see how it went. I'll do it next semester. So anyway, that was something I thought was interesting, because we heard a very similar comment made about MOOCs on Monday in one of the workshops. So anyway, the idea of bringing learning design into this equation around learning analytics we feel is really important, because it really helps the teacher think about what their design was and to articulate their pedagogical intent. And this is not a new thing. We didn't kind of make this up from our heads as such. Lots of people have been talking about this for a while, and Lockyer, Heathcote and Dawson published on this in 2013 in a paper which I'm sure most of you have read in this room. Luckily, we had Lockyer and Dawson on this project, so that's where we got our inspiration. And learning design can be used as a guide for interpretation of learning analytics data. So again, using, sort of having that semantic structure of learning design helps the teacher to be able to look at the data and make meaning of the data in a particular context and in relation to a particular learning activity. So, very quickly, just to tell you the methodology that we used that informed the development of the framework. We did a review of the literature of existing tools that were built for learning analytics, and that was, I think, a suite of about 7 or 8 tools at the time that people had developed that were sort of, in a sense, more generic. We were looking at building a generic tool for teachers, which we thought was going to be really easy when we applied for the funding. But when you get down to it, it's probably been the most difficult research project I've ever worked on in my entire life, because it's not simple to make this into a generic tool. So we reviewed the literature. We then did interviews with 12 teaching staff across the 3 participating institutions, so Macquarie, Melbourne and UniSA. And these teaching staff represented a whole range of disciplines, class sizes, different types of technologies being used in their classrooms, and different types of learning activities. So we wanted to get a really broad sample, even though it's only a small sample, to get a sense of different types of queries, needs, wants that the academic teachers would have. In addition to this, we also took very detailed maps of the pilot studies that we were going to do. So we were going to do 4 pilot studies. We sat down with each of those teachers and really mapped out their learning design so we could understand and prioritise the development of the different elements of the tool. Being a funded project, we planned for this, but we only had the money for this. So we tried to prioritise that by talking to the pilot study. So what I'll do now is hand over to Aneesha, who will actually introduce the framework and the thinking behind it.
Thank you, Linda. Oh, sorry. So this is our learning analytics for learning design conceptual framework. So what you notice about this framework, first up, is we've actually put the teacher in the loop, and the teacher is quite prominent. The main reason for this is it's the teacher that brings the learning design context. They have the knowledge of the course structure, the curriculum design, and they also know how they've translated their learning design into the LMS tools that they're using. From the interviews and our other reviews that we did, there were different types of tools and different types of requests that came from the teachers, and we grouped these together based on the type of analytics that they were after. So very prominent, of course, was temporal, so time-based, who's accessing what type of analytics. There were tool-specific requirements, so I use forums or I use wiki and I want to see what's happening inside there. And also cohort dynamics, so they wanted some way to see how different cohorts or different groups of students, or even how similar students were in terms of accessing their content. So we grouped those together into the different types of analytics that the framework would support. What was also really evident was just providing those types of analytics wasn't enough. We needed to provide a way for academics to compare across them. And this is where comparative analysis comes into it, in that any decision that the teacher needs to make will be based on looking at what's happening in any of the analytics, comparing it maybe across weeks, across different years of the cohort, and then making decisions. And so that's sort of the flow into the teacher who brings the learning design context, can use all these analytical tools, do comparative analysis, and then in making decisions, what came out from the interviews was really this need for intervention support tools. So how do I use what's coming from the analytics to then send emails to students? How do I locate those students that are of a particular group that might be needing assistance? And so we group that together in what we call intervention support tools, and we've got a category there called contingency. Now what I'm going to do is take you through the different types of analytics that were required, and we'll go through that in stages of the actual framework. But what I'm also going to do is highlight what we've done inside the loop tool to support that. So I'll talk more about the loop tool at the end of this presentation, but just to give you an idea of what visualizations we use to support different things, I'll include this here. So obviously, when you ask academics or teachers what they want to see from analytics or learning analytics, a lot of them actually say, I want to see the access statistics. I want to see how students are accessing the course. What are they using? What are they not using? And so as a researcher and a learning analytics researcher, I always found that to be a very basic requirement. It's almost like, well, why don't you want more? But one of the advantages of this project was, given that we had a qualitative study where we actually were interviewing participants, and we were able to ask them. And so we could drill down a lot more into why that need existed. So the key thing really was, in taking their learning designs and translating it into the LMS, you're taking your learning design and you're translating it into a tree-based structure that's within your LMS. So you're separating out the tools. And they really wanted to be able to reconcile the idea of my learning design with how I've implemented it in the LMS, and then how students are accessing it in that form. And this is where we think it's really crucial that the interpretation of the results and the decisions that are then made fall back on the teacher. And that is why we put the teacher as really central in our framework. So particularly with temporal analytics tool does is we provide a weekly and an overall dashboard. So this is just an example of the weekly dashboard. And we can show timelines of the content, the communication tools, the assessment, and even the unique pages that were accessed. What we also do in addition to that is we allow different types of events to be set up. So you'll see there's lines on the graphs there. So that these vertical lines, they're actually key dates. So it could be a lecture that occurs every Tuesday, and these will always show up on the graphs. Or it could be an assessment item that's due, or it could be some special event, such as a field trip. And this actually allows the academic to very clearly visualize what's happening before and what's happening after a particular event. We, of course, use spark lines just to include more data on the dashboard, and that really relates to if they were really interested in the session time, or the average session time of all students. Views. We also do top contributors of the week, a distribution of students in how they're accessing the pages on the main weekly dashboard. What we, in addition to that, do is, in part, to enable comparative analysis of that temporal data, but also the fact that just showing the access in totals doesn't really give someone a good idea of how their learning design is working or not. So particularly in the learning management system, you're always doing this tree structure, you're creating folders. What we found was the most common way to set up your folders is by week. And so we use it as our unit of analysis. We import the course structure from Blackboard and Moodle. We display it in a tree, but then we also do calculations for weekly access across the different weeks. So if that is the unit at which you're designing for your teaching, you can easily see which weeks and which content were getting a lot of access, and perhaps when they weren't. We also allow pre and post activity to be seen across the weeks. So this particularly is if there's a tutorial or you're doing a flipped lecture, how many of the students actually viewed the resource or completed the activity before or after that tutorial was held. So we do these in little pie charts and show the percentages of activity. And you can select from multiple event types there and update that particular dashboard, and it shows it all by week as well. The next type of analytics that were required was specific to the different tools that the teachers were using. So from our interviews, there was, what you'd expect basically. I want to see what's happening with quizzes more clearly. I want to see who's contributing to the forums. But there were also requirements for additional tools, such as wikis that were external to the LMS, and even social media propped up in a few interviews. So things like that myself and Kirsty Kidder have been doing with CLA Toolkit are probably relevant for this area as well. So the same week-by-week view we can do for assessment and for forum data. And what we also allow is to be able to drill down. So it's not only a high-level view so from the interviews it emerged that it wasn't only a high-level view that was required, people really wanted to drill down. So drill down at the student level, drill down at the individual resource level. The next type of analytics that we've included, and this emerged quite strongly from the interviews, is something we call cohort dynamics. And this really is targeted at how different groups or different types of students will interact with and engage with the learning design that's being implemented in the LMS. So certain learning designs might not be that accessible to particular groups of students. And what the teachers were really after here was ways of finding these different students. So particularly a common request was, I want to find students that didn't access a certain content or a tool. And this would be a certain item that the teacher or academic actually thought was crucial. So they wanted to be able to find these students and then intervene in some way. And also just groups of students, being able to locate different groups of students. So this really lends itself quite well to more advanced machine learning or clustering solutions. and then being able to drill down in those tools. So particularly here is the screen where you can drill down. So this is a particular resource, you can drill down into it, and for that particular item, and this is all accessible from the course tree structure, you can drill down and actually see the page access. Again, the date reflection of dates that were added, or key dates for assessment in this case, are clearly shown as markers there. To fulfill the simple request of being able to find students that didn't access this, we allowed basic filtering. So you could move the slider of the graph into a particular time period, and you could filter down to then see students in that time period that didn't view this particular item. That's a very simple request. However, if you're a teacher and you really think a resource is essential that they do this pre-quiz, or it's essential that they watch this video, it's a good way to identify the students that didn't do it. So comparative analysis, I've spoken about earlier, and it's really the need to compare activity across the different learning activities. So comparative analysis will really put across in the framework all the other types of analytics. So whether it's temporal or it's cohort dynamics or tool specific, it's really to be able to compare across weeks and then across different resources. And this is what we've tried to do in all our visualizations, is have that weekly view, have that tree structure view, and then allow drilling down. And of course, another way to look at this is from the student view. So these are, we renamed to make it dummy students for this demo, but you can then see student by student, which weeks they were having more activity, and you can also drill down to see a particular student's view. So that's really, I've explained each of the elements of the framework. I think the key takeaway is really that the teacher is quite important. They bring that background knowledge, and it's them that will do the comparative analysis. And that brings us to the final section of the framework, which is really contingency and intervention support tools. And these are the tools that the academic needs to use to do interventions. So particularly, part of this really becomes productivity tools. So it's being able to find the students or identify them and then quite easily perhaps email them. So things like common email templates and making that easier for academics to actually do that intervention. So particularly with our current trial and what Linda mentioned before, where the academics are actually just watching, you know, I'm interested in analytics, but I'll only do the change next year. I wonder whether it was because our tool is only a partial implementation of the framework, and it doesn't quite implement the actual communication tools to the level that we'd want as yet. So essentially the tool that I've spoken about, the loop tool, it's a reference implementation of the conceptual framework. It's a partial implementation. Particularly, it's really just implementing the temporal and the comparative analysis. It's built in Python, Django framework, and it's soon to be open source as well. So I've just got some screen grabs here to show you, which I'll go through really quickly. And this is just drilling down into an individual student, and you can do filtering there as well. And of course, future directions are really having more sophisticated ways to group some of the students and provide those intervention tools, which is where we're really heading with the tool. So I'll open up now for a discussion or any questions.
Thank you, Aneesha and Linda. Do we have any questions in the room?
Hi, thank you for the very interesting talk. Just a clarifying question. What types of courses were these? Were they fully online, and was there any face-to-face interaction with the students? So just wondering the type of interventions that teachers could do. Could they only email students or also see them in working groups, for example?
So do you want to take it?
There was a mixture. So amongst the 4 courses that we piloted with, they were all basically blended learning courses. And that, of course, is another challenge to the tool because it's only a partial representation of the learning or of the activity. But there were some courses, so the course from the University of South Australia had internal and external students. So some students were doing the course mainly face-to-face with some online activity, and other students were doing everything online. So I think it comes back to some of the cohort dynamic stuff that Aneesha was talking about. It would be really interesting if we were able to then separate out those 2 different cohorts to be able to look at different patterns of engagement there as well. But yeah.
Hi. I think the visualisations there are great and the information that's showing. I'm just a little bit concerned about the comments about teachers not changing anything yet. And that, in some ways, the data that's presented helps them punish the students who are not following their design properly.
Could. I mean, we only did this in a very small pilot example, and it would be really great. So as Aneesha mentioned at the end there, we're about to make this tool open source. What we also didn't mention in the presentation, is there is actually a second part of the tool about the learning design section. We didn't present that today because we didn't think we'd have enough time, but trying to help academics articulate, so we call it the pedagogical helper tool. And what we're hoping is that it will help match those analytics with the design. But as you say, I mean, there is perhaps a risk of looking at the students who don't fit into that design. And I think there was a really great comment made the other day about, I'm trying to remember whose presentation it was, where they said the design doesn't ever work with the students the first time. You sort of have to give it a time to see, you design something in your head, you think you know how it's going to work, but you've got to let it have that time. So I think that point comes to both what you're saying about being careful not to punish students who don't fit your conception of the design, but it also comes to what we've seen in the studies where academics are a little bit slow to react, and they maybe take a semester or 2 to understand how that design actually plays out in practice to then hopefully inform when the intervention's necessary.
Yeah, I think also the tool really helps you to find cases where they might not be matching or meeting the requirements that you want from the learning design. But as to how you actually contact them and what you tell them, I think it's basically down to good intervention techniques.
And it comes back to the teacher.
Yeah, and equipping the teachers with, strategies to deal with this in a positive way.
Congratulations on a great presentation and super work. You mentioned that it's an open source tool. Is it your vision that other institutions mirror the work that you're doing and report back to your data to join your research group, or is your research project finished?
The project is finished in terms of the funding, but we're really keen to keep going to help people implement this tool. So we'd be really happy to help support some additional pilots. But really, I think the idea of us making it open source is, A, it was a government-funded thing, so we have to say it's open source. But B, we wanted to put it out there so that people could take hold of it, help develop it further, help implement some of the other parts of the framework into the tool, customise it for your own institution. We really just want to we started it and we want to kind of put it out there so that people can continue the work.
Great stuff, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.